In the summer of 1776, a group of men sat in a sweltering room in Philadelphia and did something that had never been done before. Not in Greece, not in Rome, not anywhere in the 5,000 years of recorded human civilization. They looked at the most powerful empire on earth, the empire that owned them, that taxed them, that could imprison them without trial or hang them for treason. And they wrote down on a piece of paper that they were free. And then they signed their names to it. That act of audacity is what we celebrate every July 4th. But most people don't know how close it came to never happening at all. To understand July 4th, you have to understand what it felt like to be an American colonist in the 1760s. For most of your life, you had been proud to be British. You flew the British flag. You drank British tea. You named your towns after British cities. Boston, New York, Jamestown. You had fought alongside British soldiers in the French and Indian War, bled alongside them the forests of Pennsylvania, helped them win an empire, and you believed, deeply and sincerely, that you were part of that empire. And then Britain sent you the bill. The 7 Years' War had nearly bankrupted the British Crown. Someone had to pay for it, and the British Parliament decided that someone was the colonies. In 1765 came the Stamp Act, a tax on every piece of paper in America. Newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards, all of it taxed. And here was the problem. The colonists had no voice in Parliament, no representative who could argue against it, vote against it, or speak for them in any way. They were being taxed by people who did not represent them. And they had a phrase for that. No taxation without representation. The British repealed the Stamp Act under pressure. And then they passed the Townshend Acts, taxing glass and paint and paper and tea. The colonists pushed back. The British sent soldiers. And in March of 1770, on a cold night in Boston, a crowd of colonists began throwing ice and rocks at a group of British soldiers on King Street. Someone fired. No one knows who. When the smoke cleared, 5 Americans lay dead in the snow. The newspapers called it a massacre. Paul Revere made an engraving of it and distributed it up and down the coast. America had its martyrs. 3 years later, on a December night in 1773, a group of men dressed as Mohawk Indians crept aboard 3 British merchant ships in Boston Harbour and threw 342 chests of British tea into the cold black water. 10,000 pounds worth of tea. Enough to make 18 million cups. Gone. The British Parliament was furious. They shut down Boston Harbour. They dissolved the Massachusetts government. They sent more troops. What they called punishment, the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. And for the first time, the colonies began to talk seriously about what came next. In September of 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They sent a polite letter to King George III. They asked for their rights as Englishmen to be respected. They waited. The king did not respond. Not in any meaningful way. And then on April 19th, 1775, the war began. Not with a declaration, not with a speech. With a shot fired at dawn on a village green in Lexington, Massachusetts. No one knows who fired it. History calls it the shot heard round the world. By the end of that day, British soldiers marching to seize a colonial weapons cache at Concord had been turned back by farmers and tradesmen with muskets, fighting from behind stone walls and trees in ways that British officers considered deeply ungentlemanly. Within weeks, 20,000 colonial militiamen surrounded the city of Boston, and the war that no one wanted and everyone had been moving toward for a decade had finally arrived. By the spring of 1776, the question was no longer whether to fight. The question was what they were fighting for. A pamphlet appeared in January of that year, written by a man named Thomas Paine, who had only been in America for 14 months. He called it Common Sense. In plain language, without Latin quotations or legal jargon, he made a single argument. A monarchy is absurd. The idea that one man should rule millions simply because of the family he was born into is not tradition. It is nonsense. In a country where men crossed oceans to build lives with their own hands, what exactly did a king in London have to offer them? The pamphlet sold 100,000 copies in 3 months. In a country of 2.5 million people, nearly every literate adult read it. The Continental Congress appointed a committee of 5 men to draft a formal declaration. John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingston of New York, and a 33-year-old Virginia lawyer and plantation owner named Thomas Jefferson, who was, everyone agreed, the best writer in the room. Jefferson sat in the second-floor room of a rented house on Market Street in Philadelphia and wrote for 17 days straight. He did not read books, he did not go to the library. He said later that he was not trying to find new ideas. He was trying to put into words what every reasonable person already knew in their bones, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that when a government destroys these rights, the people have not just the option, but the duty to abolish it. He brought the draft to the committee. Adams and Franklin made small changes. Then the full Congress got hold of it and spent 2.5 days arguing over every word. They cut about a quarter of what Jefferson had written. They removed his passage condemning the slave trade, the part Jefferson himself considered the most important in the document, because the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia refused to sign it if that passage remained. Jefferson sat in his chair and said nothing, though by his own account it pained him every moment. And then came the vote. But here is something almost no one knows. The vote for independence was not on July 4th, it was on July 2nd. On the afternoon of July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress voted 12-0, with New York abstaining, to declare the colonies free and independent states. John Adams wrote a letter to his wife Abigail that night. He told her that July 2nd would be celebrated for generations to come as the great anniversary of American independence. He was off by 2 days. The Congress spent July 3rd and most of July 4th debating the final wording of Jefferson's declaration. At some point in the late afternoon, they approved it. The President of Congress, John Hancock, signed it that day. Most of the other delegates did not sign until August 2nd. The document was not publicly read until July 8th, when a man named John Nixon read it aloud in the State House yard in Philadelphia, while a crowd cheered and church bells rang. But July 4th was the date printed at the top of the document, and so July 4th is what stuck. Think about what the men in that room were actually doing. They were not generals. They were lawyers, farmers, merchants, a printer, a doctor. They were signing a document that, if the revolution failed, would be used as their death warrant. Benjamin Franklin understood this. As the delegates finished signing, someone made a solemn remark about the gravity of what they were doing. Franklin looked up and said, "Yes, we must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." He was not joking. George Washington was at that moment losing battles up and down the coast. The British had the most powerful navy in the world. They had professional soldiers and Hessian mercenaries who had been fighting wars their entire lives. The Continental Army had farmers with hunting rifles and a general who had never commanded a force larger than a few thousand men. The odds were not good. And yet, Washington crossed the Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, in the middle of a blizzard, and attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton in the dark. He crossed again a week later and hit the British at Princeton. Small victories, but they kept the revolution alive through its darkest winter, and 6 years later, with French help, it was over. The most powerful empire on earth had been beaten by a country that did not yet exist when the fighting started. The first July 4th celebration was held in Philadelphia in 1777, 1 year after the Declaration. There were fireworks and toasts and a cannon salute. The ships in the harbour were decorated with flags. Philadelphia was occupied by the British 4 months later. They celebrated again in 1778 from Valley Forge, where Washington's army had spent a winter of starvation in the snow. Some years the celebration was a defiant act, a reminder of what they said they believed even when everything was going wrong. America has been celebrating ever since. The fireworks, the parades, the flags, the speeches, the strange and specific smell of sunscreen and charcoal smoke on a hot afternoon in July. All of it pointing back to that room in Philadelphia, to those men sweating through their coats in the summer heat, to one 33-year-old with a quill pen and 17 days and something he needed to say. They wrote that all men are created equal. They did not live up to that. Not fully. Not then, and some would argue not yet. The man who wrote those words owned more than 600 people over the course of his life. The country those words created would fight a civil war less than a century later over whether those words meant what they said. The argument over what they mean has never really stopped. But that's also, in a strange way, the point. They wrote something bigger than they were. They put into words an idea so large that the country has spent 250 years trying to grow into it. Every generation of Americans has had to decide what those words mean for their time, who they include, who they protect, how far they reach. That is not a failure. That is what the document was designed to do. Not to describe the country as it was, but to describe the country it was supposed to become. So when the fireworks go up on the 4th of July, when the sky lights up over every small town and every city in the country at exactly the same moment, that is what you are seeing. Not just a birthday, not just a party. A 250-year-old argument about what freedom means. One that a group of imperfect, terrified, extraordinary men started in a hot room in Philadelphia on a July afternoon, when they picked up a pen and told the most powerful empire on earth that they were done. And they signed their names.